Hello chess fans, this is Rick from Chess to Impress with coverage of round 13, the penultimate round of the 2020-2021 Candidates Tournament. You can find my video on round 12, which was a very exciting round with Nepomniachtchi and Giri, the leaders of the Candidate Tournament, both winning with the black pieces. The link to that video is up here. The standings after round 12, Jan Nepomniachtchi has been leading the Candidates Tournament from round 1 when he won with the black pieces against Giri. He's now on 8 points out of 12 games. Half a point behind is that man that he beat in round 1, 7.5 out of 12. Vachier-Lagrave also still has a chance. He plays against Nepomniachtchi in round 13. He's 1.5 points behind. Caruana only has a theoretical chance to become Magnus Carlsen's next challenger, and Grischuk, Ding, Wang and Alexeyenko will have to wait for another chance to win a Candidates Tournament. The pairings of round 13, Wang Hao against Caruana, Nepomniachtchi Vachier-Lagrave, Alexeyenko, Ding Liren and Grischuk against Giri. The first game to finish was the tournament leader Jan Nepomniachtchi. He had the white pieces against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. For this crucial game, Nepomniachtchi had prepared knight f3 on the first move. He said after the game, as a Grunfeld player myself, I have no firm recipe what to do against knight f3 to get a fight. Because Vachier-Lagrave was in a must-win situation, and he thought that Vachier-Lagrave, being a Grunfeld player himself, might also find it difficult to find something sharp against this first move, which is very solid. Let's put the opening on the board. Let's go to move 9. Both players castled, queen c2 and a5. I was out of book here, said Nepomniachtchi, but the position is very healthy for white. Rook d1, MVL said in his interview after the game, it is hard to get a fight for black in this variation. The players looked at d6, which was not played in the game, then knight d4 and e5. But if you take en passant, the conclusion was that it is just better for white. In the game after rook d1, d6 was not played, knight e8 was Maxime Vachier-Lagrave's choice. Bishop f4, knight d6, and here bishop takes d6. Looks like a strange move, giving up on the bishop pair, but it really buries that bishop on b7. So that was a reasonable option. In the game, b3 was played by Nepomniachtchi, rook e8 and bishop e5. Nepomniachtchi said, e2, e4 is the most principled way of playing, but because of the tournament situation, I played it more safe. After e4, they looked at bishop takes c3, giving up that bishop, but you win a pawn on e4. Queen b2 and d6, and white has compensation for the pawn. Nepomniachtchi was in no mood to go for that, and after rook e8 he played bishop e5 to swap the bishop on g7. e6, the bishops come off the board, and rook a2 b1, with the standard plan of pushing the pawns on the queen side, a3 and b4, to kick that knight on c5. e5 was played, knight d2 and f5, sort of a King's Indian attack from black. Let's see what happened afterwards. b4 as planned, a takes, and now the knight has to leave that very nice spot on c5. It went to a6, and here c5 is possible. That's also good for white, but e4 was played by Nepomniachtchi on move 20. f4, knight e2 and f takes g3. You can also play c5, but again the conclusion was that after taking en passant, white is better. So MVL took on g3, and here most commentators and also the black player Vachier-Lagrave expected that Nepomniachtchi would take back with the h-pawn. But he took with the f-pawn, and he was not very happy about that after the game. He took with the f-pawn, he said, I have rook f1 with a tempo on the queen, but taking with the h-pawn would have been better. Then he has to plan f4, as Nepomniachtchi explained. In the game c5 was played, b takes, knight takes, and rook takes b6, and white has won a pawn. Queen d8, rook d2 b1 and queen c7, and MVL said, here I got a bit too happy with my position. And Nepomniachtchi said, black has a nice blockade, but how can you play for a win with black with such a bad bishop on b7? So black has compensation for the pawn, but with that bad bishop he cannot really hope to play for a win. Knight c3 from Nepomniachtchi, rook f8, rook 6 to b2, bishop a6 and knight d1. The FIDE press officer asked, "Can you double your rooks on the f-file with black?" "Yes, I can," said Nepomniachtchi, "but what do I do after that?" And Nepomniachtchi said he would put his queen on c3 and a knight on either e3 or g4, and black will not be able to penetrate over the f-file. Rook ac8 was looked at in one of the broadcasts that I followed to keep the material on the board and play against the c4 pawn. But Vachier-Lagrave played rook a to b8, and that is really saying, I give him up my hopes of becoming Magnus Carlsen's challenger in November. I have to wait a few more years, because now all the heavy pieces come off the board. The rooks, and after queen b2 also the queens. Nepomniachtchi said, "Here I checked the Grischuk Giri game and saw that Grischuk was probably going to win, so he was happy to simplify this position." White is still a pawn up, that pawn on c4, but it's firmly blockaded. It will be very hard for white to win this position, but for black it will be impossible. There's no winning plan for black. Let's just show you the remaining moves. This game ended in a draw just after the time control. This is move 40, bishop d7, and quickly the moves were repeated. And after bishop c2 on the 42nd move, the players shook hands, and this game was a draw, which is a great result from Nepomniachtchi, as said, because on the other board, Grischuk had the upper hand. Let's go to that game. We see there Alexander Grischuk with his head in his hand before the game started, with the white pieces against Giri on the black side. And Grischuk opened with the d-pawn. He said after the game, "My plan was to play as a terrorist, terrorize him with a draw, with Giri being in a more or less must-win situation with black. If he goes for equality, I will just try to force a draw, and most likely succeed. If he goes for a worse position, then I will play." And that's what more or less happened. Let's look at the opening. b6, g3, and here bishop a6 is possible to attack that pawn on c4. Then white usually plays b3 to protect that pawn, and then the bishop goes back to b7. In this game the bishop went to b7 straight away, so with the pawn still on b2. Grischuk said, "I have experience in this opening with black, but in the variation with bishop a6 and b3. Bishop g2, a check, the bishop interposed, c5, takes and takes. We have the Capablanca variation of the Queen's Indian on the board. Both players castled. Knight bd2, d6, the queen went to b3, attacking the b4 pawn. That pawn was protected, and now a3. Grischuk mentioned that he had played some training games with Vishwanathan Anand in this line. Knight a6, rook f to d1, let's put the next few moves on the board, and the bishops were swapped on g2. Grischuk explained, "I want to play e4, h4, f3, knight to c2 and the other knight through f1 to e3. Then I have a big advantage." And Giri acknowledged after the game that he did not really understand this position, this opening very well, and that he did not see Grischuk's plan. He played h5. That's a move of a player who needs to win. You have to try something. Giri is expanding on the king side. Let's put the next moves on the board. Let's go to move 20. Rook a b1, knight e6, and now rook b5 on move 20. h4 is another option, and then black has some tricks, explained Grischuk, and he showed this example. Black can then play knight back to d7, and if you continue with your plan with f3, then suddenly there is a queen sacrifice, very spectacular. It nets black a pawn after g takes, knight f4 check. Black has won a pawn, and will get the queen back with that knight fork. Nice variation. So after knight e6, h4 was not played by Grischuk. He played rook b5. You can play knight c7, attacking the rook, and then the rook goes back to b2, and I can terrorize my opponent by repeating moves if the knight goes back to e6. So Grischuk was still in terrorist mode. After rook b5, Giri did not play knight c7, probably for that reason, and he played rook f to e8. You can win a pawn with white. That pawn on e5 is not protected well enough. D takes and rook takes. But Grischuk was still aiming for the setup shown earlier with f3 and knight f1 to e3. He did not go for this pawn. Instead he played h4. g6, f3 as planned, knight d7, and there goes the knight back to f1 on its way to e3. takes, knight e5, attacking the queen, queen drop back, knight takes, knight c6, rook back to d1, that rook was attacked there, queen e6, and then finally knight e3 on move 28. Finally, white has achieved the setup he was aiming for. Giri, as mentioned, had not understood this plan, and now white is just much better, explained Grischuk. Black has weaknesses on b6 and d6, and white's pieces are better positioned than black's. Big advantage for white. Knight e7. I would not lose this position even to a computer with white, said Alexander Grischuk. That's how much better white's position is. Grischuk played queen d2, attacking that pawn on d6 with queen and rook. It's only defended by the queen. If you defend it passively with rook a to d8, that will not help black. For example, then rook d to b1, and now the b6 pawn is hanging, and if you passively protect that one with knight c8, there is c4, c5, and that is a very nice position. Both these pawns are pinned because the rooks behind them are unprotected. Very nice. In the game, Giri saw that a passive defense will not work, so he played f5. There goes that pawn. Knight c6. This move was missed by Grischuk, but no harm done. He took on f5 and g takes f5. Going into an endgame 2 pawns down. If you go down fighting, you take on e3. This did not happen because then black will get checkmated. Queen takes g6 check, king f8, and then the very nice move f6 with a checkmate threat on g7. Now it's black's turn. Queen e2 check, king h3, and now don't take that rook on d1 because of the checkmate. So after king h3 you give another check on e6, and then g4, h takes check, and king g3, and now black has no checks. You still have to deal with that checkmate threat on g7, so you play rook b7, but then there is queen h6 check, and if you go to f7, there is queen g7 checkmate, and if after queen h6 check you play king g8, then there is rook g5 check, the rook swings over, king f7, and checkmate. Giri saw all that. After e takes f5, taking on e3 does not work. He will get checkmated, so he went into this endgame 2 pawns down by taking back on f5. The queens came off, knight takes f5, winning a second pawn, knight e5, and rook d6. And now it's just a technical task for white. Let's see what happened. The rooks were swapped, and now rook d5. You can also take on b6, that also wins, but Grischuk did not want to allow any counterplay, so he played rook d5. Those rooks were swapped as well, and now we have a knight endgame with 2 extra pawns for white. Nepomniachtchi saw this position in his interview after the game, and he said, yes, knight endgames are like pawn endgames, and pawn endgames with 2 extra pawns is usually winning for white. But he still was nervous. It was too early to celebrate. Let's see what happened. Grischuk slowly makes progress and does not give Giri any chances. Giri played on probably longer than he would have played on in a normal game, but this was not a normal game. Knight c5 on move 51, and Giri resigned, giving up his hopes for a World Championship match in this cycle. Alexander Grischuk said, there's nothing to be proud of for me in this game. I really feel like a terrorist. I've decided not to show you the Wang Hao Caruana game. Caruana won with the black pieces. It's clear that Wang Hao has lost his stamina. He's exhausted at the end of this tournament. He tried desperately to play for a draw with white, made lots of move repetitions hoping that Caruana would go for the draw, but Caruana played differently, and in a final position Wang Hao could have played on, but he lost his desire to fight. That leaves the game Alexeyenko with white against Liren with black. Not an important game for the outcome of this tournament, so I will not show you the whole game, but I will show you one very nice moment. This is the position after knight e2 to d4 from Alexeyenko on move 44. If we do a body count, we see that white is 2 pawns up. Black has some compensation with his bishop pair, but white is better. And look at this move that Ding played. Bishop e4. What a move. A piece sacrifice. We'll see the point on the next move. Alexeyenko took it. Queen takes. threatening to win the piece back. This knight is now attacked by queen and rook and only defended by the queen. So rook d3 was played. And please note that you cannot play the knight away instead, because white has a back rank problem. And that's what this piece sacrifice was based on. You will get checkmated this way. So after queen takes e4, rook d3 was played by Alexeyenko. Bishop e5, attacking the knight for a third time. And now the only move that keeps an advantage for white is bishop b2. You can attack that knight a fourth time with c5 and the knight is pinned. But now there is a very nice move, knight f3. And if you take the queen on c3, then there is rook takes d8 check, king h7 and knight g5 check, winning the queen back. King g6, knight takes e4, bishop takes b2, the dust is settled and white has an extra rook. So after bishop e5, attacking that knight a third time, you have to defend it again with bishop b2. In the game, Alexeyenko defended the knight with bishop c5. That will also work, right? No, it won't, because now there is that back rank problem that white has. And with rook b8, Ding put his finger on that sore spot. Quite amazing. You have to protect your back rank, so rook d1 seems the only move, but then rook b1 comes anyway. And you cannot take the rook because queen takes b1 check and checkmate on the next move. So after rook b1, you have to protect the rook, so queen d2 seems to be the only move, and now look at this one. Queen f4. A checkmate threat on h2. The queen is overworked, the rook is overworked, all the tactics work out for black. This is a winning position for black. Quite incredible. After rook b8, Alexeyenko saw all this, and he saw that there's a big problem on the back rank, and he has to close that b file, so he played bishop b4. Rook takes, queen takes rook, knight f3, attacking the bishop, and it looks like white has got out of it. He still has an extra pawn, but his king is still unsafe. Queen f1 check was played, knight g1 only move, bishop d4, and black is going to take on f2 with a checkmate threat. White's only hope is a perpetual check, king h7, queen f4, and bishop takes f2 with a mate threat on g1. And Ding was able to walk out of the queen checks. Let's see what happened. It's very tricky. You have to calculate really well, but Ding did that. King takes c4, queen e4 check, and after king b5, Alexeyenko resigned, because after queen e5 check, the king goes to a6 and there are no more checks. Yes, you can defend against a checkmate, but then there is bishop g3 winning the queen. Quite an amazing end to this game, even though it didn't have an effect on the top spot in this tournament and in the Canada's tournament. The first spot is all that counts. So these are the results from round 13. After 4 decisive games in round 12, we have now 3 decisive games in round 13. 2 wins for black for Caruana and for Ding, and 1 win with white for Grischuk against Giri, and the draw between Nepomniachtchi and Vachier-Lagrave. And that leads to the standings after round 13. Jan Nepomniachtchi is leading with 8.5 points, followed by Anish Giri a full point behind. Caruana and Vachier-Lagrave on 7 points. Grischuk back on 50%. Ding, Wang and Alexeyenko in the bottom 3 places. There's 1 round to go. 1 point between number 1 and number 2. But because of the tiebreak situation, Nepomniachtchi has already won the tournament. If he loses the last game and Giri wins the last game, they both finish on 8.5, and then the head-to-head score will apply. And because Nepomniachtchi has won 1 game against Giri and the other one was a draw, Nepomniachtchi will then also win the tournament. So it will be Jan Nepomniachtchi who will challenge Magnus Carlsen in November and December of 2021 in Dubai for the world title. Round 14, the last round of the tournament, will be played on Tuesday the 27th of April, and we'll see Caruana against Grischuk, Giri Alexeyenko, Ding Liren against Nepomniachtchi, and Vachier-Lagrave against Wang Hao. I will be here after the round to tell you what happened. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, that you give it a thumbs up, that you subscribe to the Chess to Impress channel, and that you leave a comment. I will read them all and I will reply to them all. If you liked the video, it would be great if you could share it on social media by clicking the share button on YouTube. You can find me on Instagram, on Twitter and on Facebook. This is Rick for Chess to Impress. Thank you for watching.